Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Validity Podcast. I'm your host, Valentina Rodriguez, and we are officially on episode 2. And I am really excited about this episode because I think we're going to be deep diving into one of the topics that I've covered this past week while I'm getting my master's at USF, and it's directly applicable to training, to hypertrophy, to certain exercise modalities that you can personally utilize in your own training programs, in your clients' training programs. And it's a little bit of a polarizing idea, and it really shouldn't be if you're focusing on the science, but I kind of feel like that's just the trend with everything nowadays. But before we get into the actual science, I kind of wanted to give you guys a little update. I know at the end of last episode, we talked about the research being done at the Physique Enhancement Lab with Dr. Campbell. So we talked about reverse dieting, the scarcity of intervention studies done on reverse dieting, at least proportionately to the amount that reverse dieting is utilized in the field as a dieting approach, or rather as a post-dieting approach. But basically, we have a two-part study, and the first part is the survey study, and we have officially finished our survey. We've officially finished our IRB application. We're going over it today in like an hour and a half when our meeting starts, and we're going to be submitting it to the IRB. So then after that, we're going to be switching gears and starting the actual study design for the intervention study. And once the survey is approved by the IRB, we'll be disseminating that. So if you are a coach and you have employed a reverse dieting approach in your clients, then definitely email me. You guys know my email now. It's thevaliditypodcast@gmail.com. You can send me questions. You can send me topics you want me to cover. You can send me research that you want clarity on, that you want me to talk about, or you can send me something that contradicts anything I've said, because I am so open to being wrong. Science is an ongoing conversation that will constantly have new information added to the conversation. So I am happy to learn. So if you are a coach and you do want to be sent that survey so you can participate in the first really research ever done on reverse dieting, then email me and I can make sure you're on the list to receive that survey once it is approved by the IRB. Other than that, I'm trying to think of some life updates. We had a pretty solid week. I had an exam this week. It was on research methods. It went very well. The professor emailed me because it went so well, and that was a very, very exciting part of my week. And I'm not really sure that there's anything else. I'm officially part of the 200 Carb Club. My macros went up, my cardio went down, and I'm completely maintaining weight, so I'm super excited about that. Oh, and I released a new program, and I'm not going to make this podcast like a place where I plug any of really like my coaching or my products or anything like that. But if they are relevant to the conversation, then I'm definitely going to be connecting the two. But we'll talk about my program later, because I wrote my program weeks ago and I learned about all the stuff we're going to talk about today over the past really week. And it's really validating to see that everything, all the philosophies that I employed in my training program are directly supported by everything that I'm learning in class. So it's kind of, I already knew this, but now I know a deeper science to further solidify the beliefs I had about training and enforcing hypertrophy, maximizing hypertrophy, but also maximizing strength. So with that being said, today's episode is all about blood flow restriction and training to failure and inducing and maximizing hypertrophy. And I think that the reason why I thought this was a little bit of a polarizing topic is because there's a huge kind of debate as to, do you need to train to failure? Do you need to train to failure? Do you need to train close to failure? What is the biggest determinant of maximizing hypertrophy? And a lot of times I think the buzzword that comes out in that conversation is volume. And it just doesn't appear to be supported by the science. If you think about it, if volume was all that mattered, then you could grow a muscle by doing 1 rep 20 times. So doing 20 sets of 1. But how much are you fatiguing your muscle? How much stimulus are you actually placing on the muscle if you're doing 1 rep of, like, say, 40% of your 1 rep max? It doesn't matter if you do that 1 rep 20 times. You're not going to be exerting the stimulus that your muscle fibers need to grow. So is it really volume? Because if it was just volume, then 20 sets of 1 would be equally as stimulating for muscle protein synthesis as 1 set of 20. But it's not. All the research shows that 1 set of 20, if it's getting you close to failure, is going to maximize hypertrophy. And 1 rep maxes, I mean, trust me, I'm the first person advocating for getting strong as fuck and hitting 1 rep PRs. But that's alone is not going to maximize your hypertrophy. So this volume debate, it just keeps coming up and up. And when people are doing systematic reviews or they're doing meta-analyses where they're trying to aggregate data from different studies and you need to control for certain variables, you need to try to equate the study somehow. A lot of times researchers equate and control for volume, but that does not make sense, because even if you're talking about like, this person did 3 sets of 10 in this study, and in this study, they also did 3 sets of 10. You've equated volume, but say one of the studies has a 30-second rest and the other study has a 3-minute rest. The fatigue that each group is feeling respectively is completely different, because the rest also plays a role in the physiological and metabolite environment surrounding that muscle fiber. And that is the environment that will either maximize the stimulus needed for hypertrophy or it won't. And I know that I said in my first episode that most of the information we cover is going to be coming from the physique enhancement science class, but this is actually coming from my cardiorespiratory class. My professor is Dr. Samuel Buckner, and he's like the muscle guy, hypertrophy, BFR, anything having to do with growing muscle. It's completely his area of expertise. And he had a conversation with me about this flaw in how reviews are done and in how the volume hypothesis, if you will, is being so overly emphasized that it's overlooking other things that are very, very, very important. So his main area of research is blood flow restriction. And we're going to learn a lot about blood flow restriction. After listening to this lecture, I'm definitely going to be applying it in my training. And it's not very different from the training I already employ. It's just a different way, a more efficient way rather, of achieving what you could be achieving without BFR. So before we get into BFR, blood flow restriction training, we need to understand a little bit about blood flow in the body. And this is something we've been learning super in depth for the past 6-8 weeks, however long the semester has been going on. So I'm going to give you the overview of just what you need to know. So your blood flows in your body from your heart through your arteries, and that's how oxygenated blood is delivered to your periphery, to your organs, to your working tissues when you're exercising. Once that oxygen is delivered, the blood is now deoxygenated. It goes from the capillaries to your veins, and it returns back to your heart so it can be pumped to the lungs to be oxygenated so that you can start again. And blood flow basically occurs so that we can deliver oxygen and nutrients to working muscles. I mean, it has a lot of other purposes, but for our conversation, that's the main purpose. And when we think about our arterial pressure, so the pressure in our arteries, the pressure of the blood delivering nutrients and oxygen to the muscle, we know it's around 120 over 80 millimeters of mercury. When we're talking about venous pressure, it's a lot lower. It's like 8 to 10 millimeters of mercury. And this is important because when we're talking about blood flow restriction, we need to exert an amount of pressure. So say I'm putting the cuff right under my delt and I'm working my bicep. It needs to be a pressure to where arterial blood can still flow. So oxygenated blood can still be delivered to the working tissue. However, it needs to be higher than venous pressure because that will prevent deoxygenated blood from exiting my working tissue, my working muscle, my arm in this case. And the reason this is important is because you cannot occlude blood flow entirely. If you occlude arterial blood flow, it's dangerous. You're in a dangerous situation. Your muscles need to be receiving oxygen and blood. But if you prevent the clearing of that deoxygenated blood and therefore the clearing of any metabolites that are produced as a result of the respiration, the anaerobic respiration, the energy generation that those working tissues are currently undergoing, all those metabolites build up and they lead to fatigue. They create an environment that fatigues the muscle, that causes it to reach failure. And that is the physiological environment that maximizes hypertrophy. There are countless studies, and again, I encourage you to find one that contradicts this. There are countless studies that will support what's already known is that you maximize hypertrophy within 2 to 3 reps of failure. You don't have to reach true failure, but you do have to get close to it, 2 to 3 reps. And that is the stimulus, that's the physiological environment that maximizes muscle growth. And what BFR does, essentially, is it's almost like artificially creating that environment in the muscle, and it allows you to essentially reach failure sooner. So without BFR, let's say I pick up 15-pound dumbbells and I'm doing curls, I might be able to crank out, honestly, like 25 before I reach true failure. If I put a BFR cuff on and I'm occluding my venal return, the metabolites are going to build up in that muscle. And with the 15-pound weights, I might only be able to get like 10 because the metabolites are causing my muscle to reach fatigue and to reach failure. And so since I'm reaching failure in both cases, hypertrophy is maximized in both cases. The difference is that with BFR, it only took me 10 reps to reach failure versus 25 without the BFR cuff. So it's very important that what we are realizing that BFR is it's not this magical way to like unlock a new level of growth, like unlock a new level of hypertrophy, like increase your genetic potential. Like before you can only get this big, and with BFR, you can get even bigger. Like no, there's a limit to hypertrophy. You can only maximize hypertrophy to the extent to which you can maximize hypertrophy. But with BFR, you can have a more efficient system as to how soon, how quickly you reach failure. So we have to make sure that the entire time we're talking about this, we're all under the agreement that is supported by science time and time and time again, that we need to be reaching failure or getting damn close to it in order to be maximizing hypertrophy. And we're going to be talking about BFR and different ways to utilize BFR in order to reach that failure. So essentially, we know that BFR causes this venous pooling, that this pooling prevents the clearing of metabolites. Those metabolites build up. They create the physiological environment surrounding that muscle fiber to induce fatigue, to induce failure, and to maximize skeletal muscle hypertrophy. So when we're looking at research in the BFR world, I think it was initially kind of studied in 1998. There was a study done by Dr. Shinohara, and he essentially had these participants put on a cuff, because we know BFR is done with different types of cuffs. There's different types of BFR cuffs, and we'll get into them in a second. But basically, everyone had the same pressure, 200 millimeters of mercury, and they trained 3 times a week, 36 reps doing isometric knee extensions at 40% of their 1 rep max. And they found that the cuffed group saw increases in strength. And we're going to talk about strength and BFR later because it is not as straightforward of a relationship. But in this case, the cuffed group experienced greater fatigue because of the cuff, the pressure, the occlusion of that venal return as compared to the non-cuffed group. I mean, at 40% of 1 rep max, it was just not enough of a stimulus on its own in order to induce those adaptations. And when we're thinking about how all the participants in the specific study received the same pressure on their cuff of 200 millimeters of mercury, that actually can be a little bit problematic because it will affect the flow differently based on leg circumference. So my professor, Dr. Buckner, and Dr. Jesse did a study in 2016 where they looked at cuff width and individual differences and how they influenced the level of restriction applied in BFR. So essentially, we talk about the BFR cuff needing to be high enough to prevent venous return. So it has to be higher than your venous blood pressure, but it has to be lower than your arterial blood pressure because you still need oxygenated blood, nutrient-rich blood getting to those muscles. And so a huge metric used in the BFR world is the percent of arterial blood flow occlusion. So we're going to talk about that a lot as we continue on with the studies. But basically, you measure the cuff pressure at which you completely cut off arterial flow, and you usually reduce it a certain percentage. You can do 80%, 60%, 40%, etc. And as long as you're under the 100% arterial flow occlusion, then you're technically in the safe space of making sure you still are getting some blood flow, at least arterially, to the working muscle. So the other thing that can also vary is not just this arterial flow occlusion, so the amount of pressure you're actually putting in the cuff, but you can also vary the size of the cuff, the material of the cuff. So we're going to look at how those differences actually affect the efficacy of the training. So in the study that Dr. Buckner did, they had a 5 centimeter cuff versus a 10 centimeter cuff versus a 12 centimeter cuff. So we're looking at how wide they are. So how much surface area of your muscle they take up. And they found that smaller cuffs required a higher pressure to cut off that arterial blood flow. So the 5 centimeter cuff required a pressure of 145 to cut off blood flow, whereas the largest one required a pressure of around 120. So the size of the cuff, the width of the cuff actually does matter. And the other thing that mattered was the arm circumference. So a bigger arm required more pressure in order to cut it off. So if we're thinking back to that original study where every single participant received a cuff with 200 millimeters of mercury of pressure, everyone is actually receiving an effective differential pressure placed on their arterial and their venal flow because they have different leg circumferences, if that makes sense. So when we're thinking about not only can we differ the size, we can also differ the material. They compared the same size cuff in a study between nylon and elastic cuffs. And the nylon cut off the blood flow at 140 and the elastic material cut off the blood flow at 250 millimeters of mercury. And what they found was, okay, the nylon requires way lower pressure than the elastic to cut off this blood flow. But if we do both at 40% of arterial occlusion, so for the nylon, we'll do 40% of 140, and for elastic, we'll do 40% of 250. When they applied the 40% of arterial occlusion pressure in each respective material cuff, they found that the reps to failure were the exact same. So at the end of the day, it is all relative. It does not matter if you have a big cuff, a small cuff, a nylon cuff, an elastic cuff, as long as you are standardizing the percentage of arterial occlusion that you are using as your BFR pressure, then you can still essentially get the same result across any of the widths and materials. That being said, there is some emerging evidence that if you have a cuff that is too thick and it covers like the majority of your arm, muscle growth can actually be hindered or attenuated in the muscle fibers underneath the cuff because of the physical compression, preventing that stimulus from being maximized, if that makes sense. So you don't want a super thick cuff, because if you have a super thick cuff, then your entire muscle is just being compressed under this cuff and you're subsequently attenuating all the benefits that you're trying to get through blood flow restriction. So the thinner the cuff, the better. And then the other thing that I think would be important is comfort. If we can ensure that we are uncomfortable but without pain, then we know we're in a good place to do BFR. I know not all of us are going to have the means to establish our arterial occlusion pressure and then be able to calculate 40% of it and then put on a cuff that has exactly that percentage. A lot of us are just going to be throwing on some kind of elastic tourniquet, some kind of like BFR band from Amazon and just say, okay, this feels about right. But the good thing is that there's also research to say that we are pretty damn good at estimating when BFR feels just about right. They did a study about the perception in the non-occlusive stimulus, and they gave them a pain scale, and they said a 7 is moderate pressure but no pain, and a 10 is like, shit, bro, I'm in pain. And they found that in general, individuals typically perceived their subocclusive pressure adequately. So they were able to say, about a 7, it was typically around the pressure that they needed to be at to have efficient BFR without pain, without any kind of risk involved, at least from an occluding arterial blood flow POV. But there's also limitations to this because pain sensitivity is really fucking variable. But anyways, they wanted to standardize this, and they said, okay, not everybody has a bunch of fancy pressure stuff available to them. So can we kind of standardize this based on limb circumference? And what they found, which in looking at all these studies that we covered in class, 40% of arterial occlusion is a pressure used very often. So they found that 40% arterial occlusion pressure can be achieved if you use a cuff that is about 90% of your arm circumference or your leg circumference, depending on where you want to actually utilize the BFR. If you want to achieve 80% of arterial occlusion, then you should use a cuff that is 80% of your limb circumference. And they used the two. They used the actual measured pressure BFR band, and they compared it to the practical band, which was the one that was not measured via pressure. It was measured via percentage of limb circumference, so the actual length of the band. And it found that these two measurements and respective pressures were equated. So that's kind of one thing that you can do if you don't have, like I said, access to the fanciest $1,000 smart cuffs or air bands or whatever in the world you can spend money on. You can also just kind of use it based on your limb circumference, and know that if you do want to do a workout where you're adding in a set or an exercise that you want to do 40% of your arterial occlusion, then just use a band that's 90% of your arm circumference. If my arm is 10 inches around, then I'm going to use a band that's 9 inches, and that should theoretically, at least according to the literature, more or less mimic or achieve a 40% arterial occlusion pressure. So now that we kind of know how we can practically implement BFR in our day-to-day workouts, practices, client plans, whatever it may be. Let's talk about what are the actual adaptations to BFR. So it appears to attenuate atrophy during prolonged skeletal muscle disuse. So it can actually, if you use BFR while you're recovering from a surgery and you can't hit to the gym, I mean, assuming you're past the blood clot risk period, definitely don't do it straight out of the hospital room, please. It promotes muscle hypertrophy in response to low intensity aerobic exercise. So using BFR during cardio has actually been shown to increase hypertrophy. And more notably, it increases muscle hypertrophy and to some extent, potentially strength in response to high load resistance training utilizing BFR. So the data is definitely way more overwhelming in support of muscle hypertrophy as an adaptation compared to strength. And we'll talk about strength adaptations in a minute. But first, let's talk about how different loads with BFR vary in their ability to maximize hypertrophy. So in a study, they compared without BFR, just a lightweight 40% of your 1 rep max to failure compared to a heavier weight 80% of your 1 rep max to failure. And they found that both maximized hypertrophy. Why? Because both were going to failure. It's just kind of a matter of, what do I feel like giving my maximal effort to today? Do I feel like grabbing a lighter weight and just repping a fuck ton of weights out and reaching failure? Or am I in the mood to lift some heavy shit and maybe only get like 8 reps out? But guess what? If I'm reaching failure at both, the hypertrophic response is the exact same. So then they said, okay, so let's add some BFR to it. So they looked at different exercise loads with BFR. So they did 30% of your 1 rep max with BFR to failure, and they looked at a higher weight, I think it was 80% again of your 1 rep max with BFR, maybe 70%. And guess what? Both situations also maximized hypertrophy. So it really doesn't matter the weight that you're using, and it really doesn't matter whether you're adding BFR or not. If you are going to failure, you are maximizing your hypertrophic response. It's just a matter of, do I want to get there faster? Then maybe I'll pick up a heavier weight because I'll fail at 8 or 10 versus 20 or 30. Do I want to not pick up heavy weights today, but also get there faster? Then maybe I'll add BFR, because with BFR, I might fail at 15 reps versus 20 to 30. So it's just about what you want to give your max effort to. It's also about what you're going to enjoy, because you can have the most beautiful, optimal, hypertrophy maximizing training plan in the world. If you don't look forward to it, if you fucking hate it and you show up to the gym and your dislike for your program makes you just not give it your all, then that is going to be way, way, way less beneficial, way less optimal than a slightly maybe less than optimal hypertrophic plan that you're giving your absolute all to because you're excited, you like the plan, it gets you to show up every single day, you give it your all, etc., etc. So then they said, all right, does BFR affect glycogen depletion? We know that we are locally utilizing our glycogen stores when we're training. That is not glycogen that's being broken down to circulate systemically. It is using locally for the exercise demands for the workload. And they found that both type 1 and type 2 fiber types depleted the exact same when it comes to glycogen depletion. But they found also that whether you're doing 20 to 30% or 70 to 80% of your 1 rep max and going to failure, the majority of your muscle fibers are activated and depletion is pretty much standardized. So this is another reiteration of the same concept being measured in different ways, whether we're looking at your hypertrophic response, your glycogen depletion, the activation of your muscle fibers. All of the above are being maximized at any of the load ranges, at any of the weight selections that you're choosing, at any of the BFR or non-BFR, if you're taking everything to failure. So standardizing for intensity when looking at research, in my opinion, is so much more valuable than standardizing for volume. And I don't know, I just feel like not enough people are realizing this, and it really is so important. But it is very important to know that there is a limit. There is a threshold where reps appear to become hypertrophic. We've kind of heard like the 1 to 5 rep range is strength, and 8 to 12 is hypertrophy, and 15 to 30 is muscular endurance. I mean, okay, no, they can all be hypertrophic above probably 6 reps. So When we're reaching failure at 6, 7, 8 reps, we're already seeing that hypertrophic response. Anything less, it is likely that the muscle fiber is just not the one reaching failure. And we're not seeing that maximizing of the hypertrophic response. One thing to note is that if you go so light that you're reaching failure past 3 minutes of exercise, so if you're bicep curling for over 3 minutes straight, at that point you're doing aerobic exercise. Your body's not actually responding to resistance training. It's probably undergoing more aerobic adaptations such as capillarization, a lot more like cardiovascular adaptations. But anyways, as long as we're not training as light as 3 minutes of reps straight, and we're also not training so heavy that we can't get 6 reps out. If we're doing anything in between those, whether it's 2 minutes of reps or 7 reps, 6 reps, you're maximizing hypertrophy if you're training to failure. So again, this is all just, do I need to convince you further? In case I do, there was a study done by Dr. Furup in 2019, and they looked at elbow flexor training. They trained 3 times a week for 6 weeks. So both groups trained at 40% of their 1 rep max to failure, except one had BFR and the other one didn't. And the BFR group fatigued, they reached failure at 50 reps. And the non-BFR group reached failure at 150 reps. But the muscle volume growth was the exact same in both groups. So this further confirms the idea that BFR is really just a mechanism, a tool, a cheat code, if you will, to reduce the volume of training that you need in order to achieve the same stimulus as you would otherwise need without BFR. So it really, 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 really is a cheat code. And if we're looking at how can we optimize this cheat code, if I do more pressure, do I maximize hypertrophy more? This was a study done by Dr. Counts in 2015, and they looked at 30% of your 1 rep max with 40% arterial occlusion pressure versus 90% arterial occlusion pressure. They found that both groups grew over time. Why? Because both groups trained to failure. And the only difference was that the high pressure group experienced more discomfort. It was physically probably way more uncomfortable to have 90% of your arterial flow occluded. But that being said, they probably had to do way less reps to reach failure. So it's kind of like a pick your poison kind of thing. And in order to further confirm that the pressure really doesn't matter and the load really doesn't matter, there was a study done by Dr. Lixandrau in 2015 as well. And they basically took a bunch of different groups, 20% 1RM, 80% pressure, 40-40. So basically low pressure, low weight, low pressure, high weight, high pressure, low weight, high pressure, high weight, if that makes sense. And then they had a group where it was just high weight, no BFR at all. What they did in the study, which was key, was everybody did 15 reps. So they did not go to failure. They went to 15 reps. And in this group, the BFR group that had high pressure and high load saw the most growth, probably because with the high pressure of the BFR and the high weight, they were closest to failure at 15 reps than any other group. So it's likely due to the fact that other groups were further from failure than to the fact that the other groups had lower pressure, lower weight, or whatever. So in the last study that I'm going to bring up, that's really going to kind of talk about strength and its role and its relationship to BFR. They did another study, again, where they did 15% of your 1RM, no BFR, 15% of your 1RM with some pressure, 15% with a lot of pressure. And what they found was that all groups went to failure. So all groups grew the same. But the groups did not get stronger. And this held true when they did the second part of their study, which was in the upper body. And I'm not going to get into it because it's pretty repetitive. But at the end of the day, they found that the strength was just not increasing, even if the growth was, even if they were all going to failure. And so BFR cannot make up for an insufficient mechanical load. So if you do BFR and you have a weight that is so light, you're not going to induce hypertrophy. But it's also not going to magically make you stronger because you're not physically exerting a higher mechanical load. And so if we're thinking about muscle that's growing and not getting stronger, by definition, that means your muscle is reducing its muscle quality, which it's kind of sad if you think about it because you have a bunch of muscle now that can't lift heavier. So it's like, say my arms were like 10 inches around and I can lift 30 pounds. And now say my arms are 30 inches around, like they're massive, and I still can only lift 30 pounds. That's just, if you're defining muscle quality as the amount of muscle you have and the amount of work that muscle can do, it's a lower ratio. So the last thing that we can do is that we can point in the direction of, okay, what if you do want to get stronger? And we all know that strength does not directly cause size. We know that failure causes size, but training to failure at light loads alone will not cause strength. What you can do is you can push yourself to get stronger, but push for failure and maximize both adaptations to occur. Low volume heavy lifting is still going to be superior for strength. The data supports that. But if for you still want to add in some exercises where you're training below 6 reps, pushing yourself to get stronger, and then also turning around and pushing for hypertrophy, picking up a slightly lighter weight and going to failure, you're going to be maximizing your ability to stimulate both adaptations to occur. And the biggest thing that the research tells us is if you want to get stronger in something, you're going to get stronger in what you train in. So I'm not going to get stronger in, I don't know, pushing somebody on a football field just because I get my bench press stronger. And I'm not going to be stronger at squats if I do a different type of leg movement for strength. Some parts of strength can translate, but the most direct relationship between increases in strength is you are going to get stronger in what you train in. So I bring this up because we have to think about what we want. When we think about training, yes, a huge priority for a lot of us is getting bigger because we want to look bigger. We want to look better. We want to have more muscle. And a lot of people dismiss in the pursuit of hypertrophy, in the pursuit of bigger muscles. I think a lot of people dismiss strength, but I am here to advocate for the psychological benefits of training for strength and hypertrophy. I think that it can be very, very demoralizing to walk into the gym every single day and train solely for hypertrophy and aesthetics. I think that can place, and this is personal opinion, by the way, I think that can place an unhealthy relationship with why we train. And I think that there's a huge benefit to pursuing a performance-based improvement from our training alongside our aesthetic goals. I think if we walk into the gym and we're in the headspace of, I want to get stronger, I want to pick up a heavier weight, and I want to crank out more reps today, we can start to celebrate our body's capabilities and not just our body's physicality, not just our body's aesthetic, not just what does my body look like as a result of my training. We can start to shift, at least take off some of the pressure that we put on of like, what do I look like? And just put some of the pressure on like, what the fuck can I do? Because you get into the gym, like when I deadlifted 350 fucking pounds, did that specific deadlift make me get bigger, make me grow a bigger butt, make me get more aesthetic? Probably not. But did that give me the fucking God complex to like just fuel my confidence for, I'm still riding that high. So like, do I still think it provided a huge benefit for me? Yes, I do. And does it mean that I only went into that gym that day and only tried to hit a 1 rep max on sumo deadlifts, hit 350 pounds and walked away? No, bro. I did 350 pounds, which probably didn't do too much to grow my muscles, but it did a lot for keeping me really mentally engaged in my training, in my goals, in my workout program, feeling good about myself, getting myself to show up in the right headspace to push for failure. And guess what I did when I hit that deadlift, when I hit that PR? I took some weight off and then I repped that shit out for like 15 or 14 or 16 reps to failure. So did I maximize hypertrophy then? Hell yeah, I did. So this is why I will literally die on the hill of training for strength and hypertrophy together. Because I think if you solely focus on one or you solely focus on the other, you are missing out on the respective benefits that you can get. And the benefits don't really overlap. Can some strength adaptations later translate into the increased activation of more motor units and therefore more ability to fatigue more parts of your muscle? Theoretically, yes. So there can be visually, physical, aesthetic benefits to strength training that translate into the adaptations that you see in hypertrophic training, but strength training alone will not get you those. And clearly, as we see in the science, hypertrophy training alone, training for failure alone, does not necessarily make you stronger. You need to have a sufficient load in order to also induce the strength adaptations. So all of this is to say that if you guys follow me on Instagram, you guys know that I have been advocating for training for strength and hypertrophy for so freaking long. If you're one of my clients, you know that the majority of your plans are based around this philosophy. You know that I literally, like I said, will die on the hill where I think that you should lift fucking heavy, but then also back off some weight and rep that shit out. And the science is confirming this. So I talked about the latest training program that I released, and it's literally called a 12-week strength and hypertrophy training program. It's an oscillating 2-week split. So the first week is strength. It's a 4-day split. The second week is hypertrophy. It's a 5-day split. And you go back and forth. And ideally you run it for at least 12 weeks. And I was sitting in class, learning about all this. And it was just the best feeling ever to know that I believe I do my due diligence with everything that I do, but just to get that fully confirmed of like, damn, that training program I put out really is the most optimal according to the science and according to new science that I'm being exposed to every single day as a part of this program. So with that training program, you're going to have some low rep, high load things on your strength days, but not too much because there's a limit to how much of that we can actually do in a session, in a week, etc. And then this hypertrophy day does have a lot of training to failure. And a lot of people are going to say you can't train to failure all the time. I think that comes down to personal coaching philosophies. I do think you can train to failure a lot more often than what people typically assume. But this one has you training to failure on most exercises on your hypertrophy weeks, which is every other week. So if you are interested in that, you can find it on my website. I'll link it below, but it's VallFitt.squarespace.com. And again, I'm not trying to make this into like a plug, but I really do think that that specific program is so pertinent to what I learned in class today that I just had to bring it up and let you guys know that that is out there if you're interested. But other than that, I really think that this wraps up our little lesson on BFR, on hypertrophy, on strength. I did experience a little bit of technical issues while filming this. So if the final product is a little bit choppy, I am so sorry. But all in all, let's recap. We know that BFR is going to reduce your venal return. You're going to allow oxygenated blood, nutrient-rich blood to be delivered to your working muscles, but you're not going to allow that blood to leave. You're also not going to allow any of the metabolites that build up to leave. That's going to literally create the physiological environment surrounding the muscle fibers that you're working, create that environment that maximizes hypertrophy, that causes fatigue, that causes you to reach failure. We know that BFR can be done safely if you're under your arterial occlusion pressure, and typically people utilize somewhere between 40 to 80% of your arterial occlusion pressure. We also know that if you don't have a way of measuring the pressure of your cuff, you can take a cuff that's about 90% of your limb circumference to get 40% occlusion pressure. You can take a cuff that's 80% of your limb circumference in order to get 80% occlusion pressure. So those are some kind of practical ways that you can do it. And the biggest fucking takeaway from all of this is that whether you're using BFR or not, whether you're lifting heavy or you're lifting light, as long as you're not lifting so ridiculously light or so ridiculously heavy that you're training somewhere between 6 reps and 3 minutes of reps, you will maximize hypertrophy if you train to failure. BFR, no BFR, heavy, light, it does not matter. BFR is just a tool to allow you to reach failure faster because it's going to create the physiological molecular environment that you would have when you reach failure. You create that sooner via the metabolite buildup from the venous pooling. So the last thing is just if you want to get stronger as well and you don't want to keep building quote unquote low quality muscle, then also make sure you're training for strength. Make sure that you're actually aiming to utilize a heavy enough load to induce strength adaptations. And combining the two is probably a great way to keep your training engaging, stimulating, fun, making sure it's something you look forward to. There's probably nothing worse than just hating your training program. I think that that's probably the least optimal, regardless of what the actual training program is. It is the least optimal if you hate it and you are not showing up in the best headspace to give your 110%, because it is mentally hard to get yourself to reach failure. Like true failure, that shit is mentally hard to get there. So you got to maximize your ability to show up in that fucking zone. You know what I mean? So anyways, I decided to break up today's episode into 2 different episodes. So this week we also covered basically post-diet rebounds from a dieting perspective. And that's what we're going to cover in the next episode. So stay tuned for that. I'm going to address all the technical issues that decided to come up during this filming and hopefully look forward to your feedback. Again, if you have any questions, any comments, any research you want to bring up or anything you want to contradict me on, just email me at thevaliditypodcast@gmail.com. And if you are interested in just following along my personal socials, it is at VallFitt across Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. So with that, I hope you guys enjoyed today's episode. Let me know if you guys try BFR. I personally already ordered my bands after sitting in this lecture. And be sure to check out Dr. Buckner's research on BFR because it's very extensive and it's so interesting. So all sources are cited below. Let me know if you have any questions, and I'll see you in the next one.